Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Qdabra weekly webinar. My name is Hilary Stupa. I'm a developer here at Qdabra Software, and today we're going to talk about air handling patterns in our Microsoft flows, which are now called, well, I guess they're still called flows, but Microsoft Flow is now called Power Automate. So what we're going to talk about today is how to add actions after a failure. We're going to leverage scope to implement TryCatch and Finally. There's a community template for TryCatch and Finally that we're going to take a look at. And don't worry, we're going to talk about what TryCatch and Finally is, what this pattern is, in case it's not something you're familiar with. We're going to use analytics, flow analytics, to find failed actions, because sometimes once we're handling for errors, finding errors gets a little trickier. I boxed myself in a corner a few weeks back on that, and I want to show you a few things that I learned. We're going to look at how to create meaningful error messages, but I also just briefly want to take a quick poll about this new name. So at Ignite in November, let me see if I can select a poll here. There it is. I'm going to launch this poll, I think. Okay, I think I'm launching the poll. So at Microsoft Ignite back in November of this year, Microsoft announced that they had renamed Microsoft Flow to Power Automate. So I'm just curious what people think of this new name, whether they're just kind of indifferent or whether they think it's great or whether they're like, oh, what a terrible name. We had a little bit of an internal discussion about it. I get it. I understand this desire to kind of have synchrony across the platform, have everything start with the word power. But yeah, I kind of felt like Power Automate was a little, I'm kind of on the mass side about it. I'm going to go ahead and close that. I just was curious what you guys thought about that, because I felt like it was a little bit of a surprise. I've also seen in another blog post that Power Apps is supposedly changed now to have a space between Power and Apps, but I've noticed in my Office waffle menu that while Flow has been renamed Power Automate, Power Apps still doesn't have a space between Power and Apps. So we'll see what happens with those names. I think sometimes it takes a little time to sort of settle it out. So I want to start kind of with zero here on air handling. If you've been designing forms or if you've been designing tools for other users in your organization, you've probably already been doing some air handling. Maybe you haven't formalized it as such, maybe you haven't thought about it as such, but you've probably been doing it. The basics are, we're going to anticipate errors. That is, we're going to understand that things break, whether it's because of user input not being what we expect, or whether it's because an action doesn't do what we anticipate, or some sort of a failure on the back end. We need to anticipate that things are going to go wrong. Nothing's going to work all the time. We need to try to detect what's going wrong, and then we need to resolve what's going wrong. Now, sometimes this is truly a manual process. Sometimes it really is a matter of Joe in accounting's form wouldn't submit, and it's because Joe doesn't have permissions to submit it. But you're still doing that air handling when you go look at Joe's issue and you're like, oh, your form isn't submitting. Oh, you don't have permissions, right? So you're detecting it, you're resolving it. We need to find a way to do that within our flows, right? Because we don't want to just kind of get alerted once a week by Microsoft that our flows had an unusual number of failures and has been turned off, right? We don't want to live like that. So when you know of an error, there's a few things you can do. You can ignore it. That sounds neglectful, but there's probably cases in an automated thing like a flow where you may have a process where ignoring it is valid. So I do want you to consider that when you look at your air handling. I want you to think about whether ignoring it is a valid response. It could be, right? You could exit gracefully. You could kind of shut things down, find a way to let a user know that, hey, this didn't work. We're letting someone know, right? That could be as simple as an in step of sending an email to the user that there was a problem, and also sending an email to IT letting them know what the problem was, and so that at least the user is aware that something didn't go right. Or you can also try to fix it and continue. right? So that's another option that we have in Flow, is you could have an error state, an error case, where you're like, I think this could happen, and I'll want to go and check over here for that and then determine what to do. It really is process dependent. There is no hard and fast, this is what you must do when there's an error, because errors are a wide space, right? There's so many possibilities of things that can go wrong. So you definitely want to be investigating your process as you develop it for what you consider to be the weak points. And you can also enhance your air handling down the road once you find out the things that can and will break, right? So you could start out with something kind of minimal, and then as the flow's been in use or the process has been in use for a while, you can reflect, take some time, look back on what things have gone wrong, and then make your air handling more robust based on evidence, right? It's always good to do things based on evidence. So kind of this try, catch, finally idea. If you've written code, you're familiar with it. If you haven't written code, you've maybe seen it in some samples of code, or maybe you've heard it mentioned before. But the idea is that we're going to attempt to do something. If something fails, we're going to catch those errors and let somebody know. We're going to raise the roof. So we're going to catch those issues. And then finally, we're going to handle anything that has to be handled regardless of air conditions. So, I'm trying to think of examples to associate this concept back to things we might be used to working with. So one thought I had was, in a form, the user maybe selects an option, you query for list items, no items come back, but you want to let the user know that, hey, there's nothing related to this thing you just looked for, but you're always going to submit the form in the end, whether anything was returned or not. Or if you're using QRules commands, you might, in some cases, if success is not equal to true when you execute a command, you might take one path, and when it's equal to true, you might take another path. A common code example, and one that I think is easy to relate to, is opening a connection to a database and inserting some rows. So like in our try block in our code, we would open this connection to our database and we'd try to insert some data. And in our catch block, we would catch any errors returned when we tried to insert those rows. And then in our finally block, we would close that database connection because we don't want to leave it open. Okay, whether we have errors or not, we want to close that database connection. So that's kind of the general pattern and some samples of use case. So in Flow, we can add actions after failure. I've got a screenshot here, and we're going to go look at a little demo and add some actions after failure. We can configure this run after. It gives you some fine-grained control. Usually for air handling, I run after timed out or failed. Now, there is a use case where you might not consider timed out to be an error. For example, a colleague of mine has a flow that creates a SharePoint site using a SharePoint HTTP request from a template. And it times out on the regular because it takes a while for that site to get created. She did eventually change the timeout settings in the action, which made it not time out. But there are valid air paths where there's a timeout. So just keep that in mind. Is skipped is usually related to, something being conditional. That's when something is skipped. And so usually for my success path, I've got a skipped or succeeded. And you can see that this run after is dependent upon the action above it. So let's go take a look at one of my really, really beautiful demo flows that I have set up here. And let's hit edit on this. You can see we've been failing like mad over here. And the reason we've been failing, you will soon ascertain, is this step right here. There is actually, even in my demo site, nothing named not a real list. Okay, so get items is always going to fail. So if we want to configure run after, this step we can't do configure run after because it immediately follows the trigger. Okay, so you can't configure run after on an action that directly follows a trigger. That's what our information tells us right there. But if we add a new step, and I'm just going to use an email notification, right? I'm going to send it with a subject of fail. I can't type today, you guys. It's just been a week of Mondays in my world. And let me just type fail again. Okay, so to configure run after, right here, configure run after. So by default, it's going to run after successful. If I remove that, you can see I immediately get an error. You have to have at least one status checked, right? So I'm going to say if it's failed or if it's timed out, and I'm going to hit done. Now notice how that line changed to a red dashed line, okay? And so now I'm going to go ahead and add a parallel branch, and I am also going to do a notification, and this is going to be my success path. Okay, and obviously we would never leave our actions named like this. We would give our actions meaningful names, but that is because we are doing a simple demo here. So I'm going to make sure that this guy runs after success or is skipped. In this case, this action is not going to get skipped, but it's just kind of a default habit of mine. So now I've got my two paths. I'm going to hit save and I'm going to test this. A lot of times when I build a new flow, unless I'm basing it off of when an item is created, I just start with a button trigger because it's so easy to test with, and you can always change that trigger later. So I'm going to go ahead and perform the trigger action and run and done. So we know it's going to fail. You can see we've got this notification right up here that the flow run failed, and it did send me an email notification that it had failed. And the reason it failed was, we've got a 404 here, list not found. Okay, so those are the basics for configuring run after. While we are here, I wanted to also point out the settings. Now, as I mentioned, my colleague's flow was having regular failures because of timeouts. There's a few things you can adjust here if you're having a timeout issue. This duration, it's ISO 8601. In the slides, I've got a link to this Wikipedia page for what durations look like. Okay, so P means that it's a duration designator. We use T for time so that you can have like PT5M, right, for a 5-minute timeout. Or if you want something to fail, you could do something like PT5S, right, to make it fail fast, right? So all of these things are outlined here in this Wikipedia page, and definitely, like, this is pretty understandable. It's just a matter of you've got to go look up, or I should say I have to go look up what this format is. So this example, P1D, that's a duration of 1 day, okay? The default retry policy is what's always selected. Exponential interval, I'm not mathy. Exponential interval, the last time I looked it up, meant that it started with a lower time frame and then increased exponentially as it retried. So you may want to change this in some cases to a fixed interval. Again, the interval is a ISO 8601 time interval. You can specify the retry count. So keep these settings in mind. I just figured as long as we were looking at these things, it was good to point out. And I also have a link in the slides to a forum post on these tracked properties, which I honestly hadn't noticed before. And apparently they can be useful. So I encourage you to go take a look at those. I don't want to drag everything into this webinar though, because I'll just throw in everything plus the kitchen sink if we start going down each rabbit hole. Okay, so that is our basics of how to add, just go ahead and add an action here after air. We've got a success path here. But what happens over here in my success path if I've got some new steps? Let's say I'm also going to update some items, right? And I will, I don't know, we're gonna just, we're just going to get the weather. Okay, so let's say I'm also going to get the forecast for today. And if it fails, then I want to alert someone. And if it succeeds, I want to do something else. Well, then I'd be adding another parallel branch here too, wouldn't I? I'd be branching again and so forth for every action through my flow, every action that I felt had a risk of failure. That would get messy really fast, as you can envision. So Instead, what we can do is we can leverage scope. There's a template that already exists that's a community template that we're going to take a look at. But if you already have flows that are in production and you want to add air handling to them, you do not want to start with a template, okay? Scope allows us to group our actions together, and the entire scope can have run after configured, the same way individual actions can. So if we take a look, and I have a feeling I'm like speeding up again as I go. I have a tendency to do that. I get excited and then I start talking faster and faster. If we take a look at something like this, and this guy, he has several actions that I want to run on air. Here's my main action. But then after these actions run, I want to do this apply to each to get some values back from the action. And then I want to send myself an email notification with information from here. And I can't combine these actions without adding scope. So we'll add scope here for our air. Now, I've had better luck in Flow myself when I want to move things around to add the thing that I want to move into above. That's been true for me for conditions as well as things like scope. So you may have different luck, but I have had much better luck dragging things up than dragging them down. So there's my apply to each, and here's my send email notification. Now I can configure my run after. So if it's going to be, if it's failed or has timed out, done. Now I've got my air path right here, and I've got everything that's going to happen should the item above it fail. Now, if I had had multiple items up here, I could go ahead and just add scope again. And I usually do like a main scope and an air scope. And then I could have all of my actions up here. So what I've done personally with existing flows where I wanted to add air handling is I've put in a scope for the main scope. I've moved all of my actions into the main scope. I have to reconfigure this. Whoops, cancel. I have to redo my run after because I lost that when I went to scope. And then I have an air handling scope. So you can take you can take your existing flow, put a scope on there, move everything from your existing flow that doesn't have to do with air paths into your main scope, add a quick air handling afterwards. And what will happen is if anything here in the main scope fails, it'll trigger the air handling path and you'll get an email or a notification, or it will do whatever you've got set up to have happen there. You can also, do something like this where you've got some things happening, some stuff that happens specifically on success, some stuff that happens on fail or timeout, just using a parallel branch here, just like we talked about in the initial demo. So that allows you to go ahead and add scope to something or add air handling, to something that doesn't already have it. It takes your existing flow and adds to it. However, one thing you need to be aware of when you do this is that this is going to change whether or not the flow reports air. So I already hit save. Let me try. Test is where I wanted to go. So let's test this. Now we already know this is going to fail. It's going to fail because this is also querying, not a real list. That was my easy demo way of getting things to set up. And okay, so this is actually behaving differently today than I've seen before. Oh, here we go. This action failed. Okay, so if your air handling has an action that fails, which I just did, let us fix this. This is failing because this guy is taking something from this guy, which is non-scope. So we're going to get rid of this. Don't you love it when things fail in demo? And now this should be fine again. I should have had better notes about what I was adding here. I got carried away and added that scope. I'll perform the trigger action because I want you guys to see this because it does matter. I'm not just entertaining myself. This is important. Okay, so did it again. Oh, get items, not a real list. Okay, I'll show you my other one. I will show you demo 3. I think demo 3 I've got set up correctly to show this. Let me pop in there. Yes, this one's set up correctly. Okay. So what I'm trying to get to here is even though my flow is hitting an air path, what's happening, okay, so this one I see, I've got my apply to each completed here. I didn't have my apply to each completed there. So what was happening in the previous one was the air scope itself was failing. And if the air scope itself fails, then you're not going to get notified that something failed, right? Because something was failing prior to the send an email notification. Whereas, like, let's go take a look at it again. Take a look at one of those failed runs. I think it was this one. Okay, so in this run, you can see my air handling itself failed. So something failed prior to sending the email notification. And that's something to be aware of, that you want to make sure that your air handling path is not likely to have failures, because now all of a sudden nobody's getting notified. I had that problem with one of my client flows where I had this air path, and the first thing I was doing was sending an air email to the submitter, and it was relying on data from an action that had failed previously. And so I couldn't get that data, right? And so the air path itself was failing, and that was a problem. And the way it was failing, it actually wasn't reporting error back up at the flow level. So we weren't getting notified of errors at all. However, if your air path isn't failing and your main path does fail and goes to this air scope, what you're going to see happen here, finally, is that the flow itself doesn't report error, okay? And this is what I wanted to show you. So the flow thinks it ran successfully. You and I, looking at this, can see that our main scope failed, right? And that it went to the air scope. And that can make it a little trickier to track down what exactly is failing, right? You've gotten the email that things have failed, but you're not really sure which flow has failed or what action has failed. Because when you come and you look at the flow, you're like, look, it's just all success. It's just, there's no failures there, okay? So keep that in mind as you're kind of working through how you want to handle your errors. Now there is a TryCatch Finally template. This is a community created template. It has a sample that includes a link back to the failed run. This is nice because then you have a clickable link in the error notification that takes you back to the flowed fail. And you, of course, can copy this link out and use it in your flows if you're adding air handling to an existing flow. So if we go here and we just do new, create from template, and I just want to show you the template so you can see what it looks like. And it is TryCatch. There it is. And we'll go ahead and just create something new. And this one also starts with a button. And that's just fine because you can replace that trigger. So it has some nice comments in it, makes it pretty easy to use. This is an example trigger. It can be replaced if required, right? Try, this is where the main steps of the flow go. So this is where all of your main steps are going to go. And then down here in the catch, here's where your air handling goes. And you can see this is using get my profile and send an email, which is just fine. And then it has a finally scope down here that runs after all of these things. So it runs after the catch. Okay, and so we'll just go ahead and hit cancel there. So this is the link I was talking about. I do have this in the presentation as well, slightly modified. You'll see when you open this up that it has United Kingdom.flow. I'm assuming the maker was using, is in the United Kingdom. That was his environment. And that's all right. It seems to redirect just fine. Here's my messy notepad. Let's pop up something fresh. It seems to redirect just fine. Basically, it's getting back information from the workflow, including the environment name, the workflow name, and the workflow run information. And what that means is your error message now has a link in it that is clickable to get you back to the flow that failed. So I think, not that guy, I think my webinar demo 3 had one of those links in there. I am just nicely inundating myself with these, and my dog is sneezing. Okay, my dog is done sneezing now. Okay, so here is a notification that I sent myself, and you can see, look, this isn't pretty, but you know, we can make it prettier. That's not it. Making the email pretty isn't a problem. So if I just click on this link, it should pop open for me my flow that sent the error information. And you can see it shows right here that my flow ran successfully, but this is my flow that sent me the error message. So it's really easy for me to get back to the flow that failed. So this template, this link itself is just a very useful thing. And I've retrofitted some of my air handling flows to include that information. So it's a pretty straightforward template and it's easy to use. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to be returning success when we've got that air scope, as long as our air scope doesn't have errors in it, right? Even if it's following the air path. So another way to find failed actions is to use flow analytics, okay? And flow analytics shows the errors. It does have a little bit of a timing delay in terms of how often that data is aggregated. There's also some licensing things to be aware of. I included links to these things in the slides, but you can see this article was from December 20th, 2017. So it talks about the licensing required for analytics, but I believe that that has changed with the October 2019 pricing changes. So just kind of worth being aware of. So if we want to look for the analytics, we can go from here and go analytics, right? Or we can go to this and we can go to analytics. If you haven't got the type of license they want you to have, it'll prompt you to have a trial license for however number of days. Okay, so just be aware of that. So you can see here that the range is the last 30 days. Note the last refreshed at. I'm finding every 3 to 4 hours is how often that data is refreshed, so something to be aware of. To find errors, I think it's easiest to go to the errors tab, and then I usually just click down here on the date, and you can see, you know, what the errors are. You can click on them to go further. You can click here to get into the flow. Okay, so these analytics are another place for you to go find those errors. Again, I would highly recommend that whatever notifications you're using include a link back to the failed flow. I think that's the easiest route for tracking errors. But this is also, the analytics are also a good way to go check and see if you've got some sort of systemic problem, or if there's been some sort of failure on the Microsoft side when a lot of things have started failing. I saw that, I think it was November 21st. We had a bunch of stuff that just failed with a bad gateway. And then it all just cleared up automatically on its own, okay? And so that is a place to go see where errors are happening, is in your analytics. Again, for meaningful error messages, providing a link in the error email directly to the failed flow is great. And you can also use expressions to return error info from all failed steps in a single statement. And that was in my email that I showed you. It's not a very pretty email. You can see issue with action, get item, status, failed, code, not found. Okay, so again, that could be formatted a little more nicely. But here is how you can get that information. And it is in Flow 3. Yes, I want to leave. Let's go take a look at that guy real quick. It's outlined here in this blog by Rob Windsor. Another really good blog is this one by Thomas. Check out both of these. There's links in the slides to these. But this outlines how to get this information back about what failed. And basically, we create a variable, and that's for our error details. Variables have to be, at this point in time, created outside of scope. So that's why this variable is hanging out here all by himself, and he isn't put away in his scope. And then in your error scope, the first thing we're doing is we're filtering an array. This is the result of the main scope. So we're taking the result from the main scope, and if you named your main scope my space main space scope, it would be result of my underscore main underscore scope. So just keep in mind that you know, you need to use the name of the action, and the action name there is going to be spaces replaced with underscores, okay? And then we create an array, and that's for failed and timed out actions. And we're getting the item status back from that. If it contains the item status, we're creating that array. And then for each of these, because the main scope, let's say we had 10 actions in here and several of them failed somehow. Okay, we had a condition and we had a yes path and a no path, or we had some sort of a structure where we had more than one thing fail in here. This array allows us to get everything that failed or timed out, okay? And then we're appending it, we're taking the body back from this array right here that we've created, and we're appending it to our string variable. And you can see right here, we've got the items applied to each, the name, the status, and the code. Look, guys, I don't know these details about what's returned, but fortunately there's these blog posts where some really smart people have tracked down what's returned, and he said, look, you can get back this information. And this blog post will show you how to set this up. I have a sample flow for this that I'm including with the webinar packet that has this set up. So these things are universal. This stuff is universal across flow, that you can get back this name, this status, and this code. Obviously, I should have put some breaks or something in here so it showed up a little more nicely in my email notification, but this gives you the general idea. And what's useful about this is then your air path has not just a link to the flow where the user can go look at it, but it tells you exactly which action had the problem. So you can imagine in a large flow with a number of actions that it would be very convenient to know which actions the problem were with, especially if you had nested conditions or you had a lot of different branching paths. Anything more complicated than a webinar demo, having this level of information helps you handle errors more efficiently, right? And that's what we want. We want to be handling our errors, but we also want to be able to not have to go digging through flows, finding the one that maybe failed, and searching for possible issues. That is pretty much it. If you have any questions, pop one into chat. I hope you will go take a look at your flows with a critical eye, see where you can add some air handling. I encourage you to use Scope for it. Send yourself or whoever the person is who might be able to fix the problem, some notification that things are failing. Make sure your end users are alerted to failure, because it's a lot better to know something's gone wrong than, say, to be waiting for a PDF that OneDrive is never going to convert and send you, right? And add some air handling to your flows to make them more robust and more reliable. In some cases, there may be actions you should be taking when there's an error that would allow you to resolve the situation. And these are all extremely process specific. So you need to take a critical look at your process, see what's failing now, what are the likely candidates for failure, and then start adding some air handling so you don't just have flows that flat fail and nobody knows about until a week later, okay? Let me know if you have any questions. I think everybody has my email address, or you will by the time I send you links to the slides in the video. If you haven't heard about Forms Viewer, I really encourage you to take a look. There's a lot to it. It grows all the time, and it's available for download from the SharePoint store. So thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you're inspired to go add air handling. Be sure to check out those blog posts. There's links in the slide deck, and keep building cool stuff. Have a great day.